The afternoon Clara Dunnigan walked into the Black Mule Saloon, every man inside stopped breathing. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the hard, weathered way that the desert makes women beautiful. Sun-darkened skin, calloused hands, eyes the color of creek water after a storm. No, they stopped breathing because of where she was walking. Straight toward the corner table. Straight toward the one chair in all of Carrion Creek, Arizona, that no living soul approached without invitation. Elias Kane sat in that chair. He didn't look up from his whiskey. He never looked up. The whole town had learned that about him in the 14 months since he'd ridden in from nowhere, killed 3 men in his first week, and simply stayed. Like a rattlesnake that had found a warm rock and decided it belonged there. Clara stopped 2 feet from his table. The floorboards groaned under her boots. Behind the bar, old Tommy Mudd slowly lowered himself below the counter. Because the last person who'd stood that close to Elias Kane without permission was currently buried in an unmarked grave behind the livery stable. Clara opened her mouth. And what she said next would split this town in half, start a war that had been brewing for years, and force the most dangerous man anyone had ever known to make a choice that no bullet could solve. She said, "Marry me, Elias. Tomorrow." He looked up. Slowly. The way a wolf lifts its head when it hears something it doesn't understand. And he said 4 words back to her. 4 words that changed everything. But before I tell you what those words were, you need to understand what brought Clara Dunnigan to that table, and why asking Elias Kane to marry her wasn't madness. It was survival. Clara Dunnigan had not always been desperate. There was a time, not long ago, maybe 3 years, when she had been the closest thing to royalty that Carrion Creek would ever know. Her father, Hector Dunnigan, had been the first man to stake a claim in this godforsaken stretch of southern Arizona, back when the land was nothing but mesquite, scorpions, and silence. Most men who came out here in those early years died or moved on. Hector did neither. He found water. Not a trickle. Not a muddy seep. A genuine underground spring that fed a creek wide enough to water cattle, irrigate crops, and give life to what would eventually become a town. He built his ranch around that water source. He named the creek. And when other settlers began arriving, drawn by rumors of fertile ground in the desert, Hector Dunnigan was the one who decided who got to drink. He wasn't cruel about it. He charged fair prices. He shared when drought hit. He built the town's first well with his own money and his own back. But everyone understood the arrangement. The water belonged to the Dunnigans. The town existed because the Dunnigans allowed it to exist. Clara grew up in that understanding. She learned to ride before she could read. She could track a steer across hard rock, mend a fence line in the dark, and shoot a coyote at 200 yards. Her mother had died during a breech birth when Clara was 7, the baby died too, and after that, Hector raised her alone. He raised her the way he would have raised a son, because he had no son, and because the desert didn't care about gender. It only cared about whether you were strong enough to last. Clara lasted. By the time she was 22, she was running half the ranch operations herself. Hector's knees had gone bad. His eyes weren't what they'd been. He spent more time on the porch with his pipe than in the saddle, and Clara took over without ceremony, without complaint. She hired hands, negotiated cattle prices, maintained the water rights that kept the town alive. She was respected. Maybe even feared, a little, in the quiet way that competent women in hard country are always feared by men who suspect they couldn't do the same. Then Hector died. It happened on a Tuesday. Unremarkable. He was walking from the barn to the house, and his heart simply stopped. Clara found him face down in the dirt between the corral fence and the front steps, his pipe still warm in his hand. She didn't scream. She didn't cry, not then. She knelt beside him, pressed her fingers to his neck, felt nothing, and sat there in the dust for a long time, watching the sun go down, understanding that everything was about to change. She was right. The trouble started within a week of the funeral. a man named Buford Crawley paid her a visit. Crawley was the owner of the Carrion Creek Mining Company, a grand name for what was essentially a crew of 40 rough men pulling copper ore out of the hills east of town. Crawley had arrived in Carrion Creek 2 years earlier with money, ambition, and the flat, patient eyes of a man who viewed other people as obstacles to be moved. He wore a suit even in the desert heat. He never raised his voice. And he wanted Clara's water rights. He explained it to her politely, sitting in her father's chair on her father's porch, drinking coffee from her father's cup. The mining operation was expanding. They needed water for the sluice works, for the men, for the mules. The current arrangement, buying water from the Dunnigan Ranch at market rate, was inefficient. He was prepared to offer a generous sum for the rights. Very generous. Enough for Clara to sell the ranch and live comfortably anywhere she chose. Clara said no. Crawley smiled. He set down the coffee cup. He said he understood. Grief made people sentimental. He said he'd give her time to think about it, and he walked away with the unhurried stride of a man who wasn't worried, because he had other ways. Those other ways revealed themselves gradually, the way a noose tightens. First, Clara's ranch hands started quitting. One by one, they came to her with excuses, family obligations, better pay elsewhere, health concerns. She knew Crawley was behind it. He was offering double wages at the mine, and men with empty pockets don't have the luxury of loyalty. Then her cattle started disappearing. Not many at first. A steer here, 2 heifers there. Rustlers, people said. The desert was full of them. But Clara tracked the missing animals to Crawley's mining camp, where they'd been slaughtered and fed to his workers. She brought this evidence to the town sheriff, a man named Bill Proctor, who listened carefully, nodded sympathetically, and did absolutely nothing. Because Crawley was paying him too. Clara understood then that she was being squeezed. Slowly, methodically, Crawley was dismantling everything her father had built, cutting away her support, her income, her ability to hold on. He didn't need to threaten her. He didn't need violence. He just needed time and money, and he had both. Within 6 months of her father's death, Clara Dunnigan was nearly broke. She had 4 ranch hands left out of 15. Her herd had been halved. The fence lines were falling apart. And Crawley came back to her porch with a second offer, lower than the first, because he knew she was weakening, and because men like Buford Crawley could smell desperation the way coyotes smell blood. Clara said no again. But this time, Crawley didn't smile. He leaned forward and said very quietly that she should consider her position carefully. A woman alone, on a remote ranch, with no family and dwindling resources. Terrible things happened in the desert. Accidents. Fires. He said he would hate for something like that to happen. He left. That night Clara sat on the porch with her father's rifle across her lap, watching the darkness, listening to the coyotes howl. And understanding with perfect clarity that Buford Crawley was going to take everything from her, the water, the land, her father's legacy, and there was nothing the law could do about it. Because the law had already been bought. She needed something the law couldn't provide. She needed someone Buford Crawley couldn't buy. She needed Elias Kane. Nobody knew where Elias Kane had come from, and nobody asked twice. The first person who asked was a miner named Garrett Scholes, a big man with a bigger mouth, who made the mistake of sitting down next to Kane at the Black Mule Bar on Kane's second night in town and saying, "So where you riding from, stranger?" Kane didn't answer. Scholes asked again, louder, because he'd had 4 whiskeys and his judgment had drowned in them. Kane turned and looked at him with eyes that were the pale gray of gunmetal, not cold exactly, but empty in a way that was worse than cold, and Scholes felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child hiding under his bed during a thunderstorm. He felt the nearness of death. Not as a concept. As a physical presence. Standing right beside him, waiting to be invited. Scholes excused himself, went home, and never spoke to Elias Kane again. The second person who asked was a cowhand named Pete Albright, who intercepted Kane on the street 3 days later, apparently not having heard about Scholz's experience, or not caring. Albright was drunk too. It was always the drunk ones, and he didn't just ask where Kane was from. He blocked Kane's path and demanded to know his business in Carrion Creek. Perhaps he was trying to impress someone. Perhaps he was simply stupid. Either way, Elias Kane broke his jaw with a single punch, stepped over his groaning body, and continued walking to the general store to buy tobacco. The third person who asked was a deputy named Rawlings, who tried to arrest Kane for the assault on Albright. Rawlings drew his gun. Kane drew his faster. Not slightly faster, faster in the way that lightning is faster than a man walking. Rawlings never saw the draw. He only heard the click of the hammer being pulled back and felt the barrel pressed against the soft space beneath his chin, and he understood with bowel-loosening certainty that he was going to die. Kane didn't kill him. He took the deputy's gun, emptied the chambers, handed it back, and walked away. But Rawlings quit his position that evening and left town on the morning stage, and no one blamed him. After that, nobody asked Elias Kane anything. What they did instead was watch. And from watching, they assembled a fragmented portrait of the man, the way you might reconstruct a shattered mirror, pieces that reflected something, but never the whole image. He was tall. Not exceptionally so, but he carried his height in a way that made him seem larger than he was, the way certain predators appear bigger through sheer presence. He was lean, hard-bodied, somewhere between 35 and 45, impossible to pin down because his face had the ageless quality of men who've spent their lives outdoors in punishing country. His hair was dark, shot through with early gray at the temples. He wore it longer than was fashionable, pushed back under a flat-brimmed hat that had seen more weather than most buildings in town. He wore a gun on his left hip, a Colt Navy revolver, well used but immaculately maintained. The holster was tied low on his thigh, the way men tied it when they expected to draw in a hurry and frequently did. His hands were scarred. Not the random scars of ranch work, but the specific, deliberate scars of a man who had used his hands as weapons many times and had the damage to prove it. He rented a room above the Black Mule Saloon. He ate at the counter of the hotel dining room, always alone, always facing the door. He drank whiskey in measured quantities, enough to take the edge off but never enough to dull his reflexes. He spoke to almost no one. When he did speak, his voice was low, controlled, carrying a faint accent that some people thought was Texan and others thought was something else entirely, something older, from farther east. Maybe Virginia or the Carolinas. In his first 14 months in Carrion Creek, Elias Kane killed 3 men. The first was a drifter who tried to rob him in the alley behind the saloon. Kane shot him once, center mass, from a distance of 4 feet. The second was a bounty hunter who rode into town specifically looking for someone matching Kane's description, which told the town that Kane had a past worth hunting, even if they'd never learn its details. The bounty hunter called Kane out in the street at noon, formal as a church wedding. Kane outdrew him so badly that witnesses later said the bounty hunter's gun was still in its holster when Kane's bullet hit him. The third was one of Crawley's miners, a violent drunk who came at Kane with a knife during a card game dispute. That one Kane killed with his bare hands, snapping the man's neck with a motion so practiced and efficient that the doctor who examined the body later said it was done with surgical precision. 3 killings in 14 months. Sheriff Proctor investigated none of them with any seriousness, partly because all 3 were clearly self-defense, and partly because Bill Proctor was terrified of Elias Kane and had the good sense to know it. The town gave Kane a wide berth. They whispered about him in the spaces he didn't occupy. They speculated that he was a former soldier, a former outlaw, a former lawman gone bad. Some said he was hiding from something. Others said he was waiting for something. A few suggested he was simply a man who had run out of places to go, and had stopped here the way a stone stops at the bottom of a hill, not by choice, but by the exhaustion of momentum. Whatever he was, one thing was universally agreed upon: Elias Kane was the most dangerous man any of them had ever encountered. And approaching him uninvited was an act of either supreme courage or terminal foolishness. Clara Dunnigan knew all of this when she walked into the Black Mule Saloon that afternoon. She knew what he was. She knew what he'd done. She knew that the ground around him was haunted by the men he put into it. And she walked up to his table anyway. Because Clara Dunnigan was not foolish. And she was not brave, or rather, her bravery was the practical kind, the bravery of a woman who has calculated every other option and found them all to be dead ends. She needed a husband. Not for love. Not for companionship. For war. The Black Mule Saloon fell so silent when Clara approached Elias Kane's table that you could hear the candle flames guttering in their tin holders. 8 men were in that room, 9 counting Kane, and every one of them was holding his breath, waiting to see if they were about to watch a woman die. Clara didn't hesitate. She stopped at the table, met Kane's eyes, those gray, empty, wolf's eyes, and spoke clearly enough for every man in the room to hear. "Marry me, Elias. Tomorrow." The words landed like a gunshot. Behind the bar, old Tommy Mudd crossed himself. At the poker table near the window, a miner named Sullivan dropped his cards and didn't bother to pick them up. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Kane looked at her. He studied her face the way a man studies a landscape he's planning to cross, noting the terrain, the hazards, the distances involved. His expression didn't change. His hand didn't move from the whiskey glass. The only sign that he had heard her at all was a slight narrowing of his eyes, barely perceptible. The kind of reaction a gunfighter gives when something unexpected enters his field of vision, and he's deciding whether it's a threat. 10 seconds passed. 15. The silence was so total that Clara could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the sweat tracing a line down the back of her neck despite the coolness of the saloon's interior. Then Elias Kane spoke. 4 words. Low. Even. Completely devoid of emotion. "What's in it for me?" Not yes. Not no. Not confusion or anger or ridicule. A calculation. A negotiation. The response of a man who treated every interaction as a transaction and needed to know the terms before he signed. Clara had prepared for this. She pulled out the empty chair across from him, an act of audacity so staggering that old Tommy Mudd later said it took 10 years off his life just watching it, and sat down. "Half my ranch," she said. 800 acres. Water rights to Dunnigan Creek and the spring that feeds it. 300 head of cattle, what's left of the herd. And the legal protection of a married man's claim to property, which means Buford Crawley can't take it without going through both of us. She laid it out plainly, without artifice. She was offering him land, water, livestock, and a legal claim, everything a man in the West could want. Everything a man like Kane, who owned nothing but a horse, a gun, and whatever ghosts he carried, could never acquire on his own without years of labor or an act of God. Kane listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he took a slow sip of whiskey and said, "You're being squeezed." It wasn't a question. "Crawley wants the water," Clara said. "He's taken my hands, my cattle, and the sheriff. He'll take the ranch next. By force if he has to. I need someone he can't buy and can't scare." "You need a guard dog," Kane said. Clara didn't flinch at the characterization. "I need a partner. One who can't shoot." Something moved behind Kane's eyes then, just a flicker there and gone, like heat lightning on the horizon. Not amusement exactly. Something closer to recognition. As if he'd heard a language he hadn't spoken in a long time and was surprised to find he still understood it. "Crawley's got 40 men," Kane said. 40 miners, Clara corrected. "Not gunfighters. Picks and shovels, not pistols. He's got maybe 4 who can handle a weapon properly, and his foreman, a man named Declan Marsh, who thinks he's fast." "Thinks? I've seen you draw, Mr. Kane." "Declan Marsh isn't in the same conversation. Kane's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. On his face, it was hard to tell. He was quiet for a long time after that. Clara waited. She had gambled everything on this moment, her pride, her safety, her life, and she knew that pushing him would be a mistake. Men like Elias Kane couldn't be pushed. They could only be presented with a proposition and left to decide on their own terms. Outside, the afternoon sun was slanting through the saloon's dirty windows, casting long bars of amber light across the floor. Dust motes drifted in the beams like tiny planets in orbit. The sound of a horse being led past the building filtered through the walls. Somewhere far away, a hammer rang on an anvil. "I don't want a wife," Kane said finally. "I'm not offering to be your wife," Clara replied. "I'm offering to be your business partner. The marriage is legal protection, nothing more. Arizona territory law gives a husband full rights to defend his wife's property. It means Crawley can't challenge the water claim without challenging you. And I don't think Buford Crawley wants to challenge you, Mr. Kane. I think that's the one thing in this town he doesn't want to do." Kane looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked down at his whiskey. Then he looked at the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it, or perhaps remembering someone who once had. "Tomorrow," he said. Clara blinked. "Tomorrow? You said tomorrow? Where?" Clara Dunnigan felt the tension drain out of her body so suddenly that she almost laughed. She didn't. She kept her face as controlled and neutral as his, because she understood instinctively that showing too much emotion in front of this man would be a tactical error. "The church," she said. 10 o'clock. Kane nodded once. He returned his gaze to his whiskey glass. The conversation was over. Clara stood, pushed the chair back in, and walked out of the Black Mule Saloon without looking back. Her boots sounded on the wooden boardwalk outside, steady and measured, the footsteps of a woman who had just struck a deal with the devil, and was trying very hard not to think about the price. Behind her, in the saloon, the men slowly began to breathe again. Old Tommy Mudd surfaced from behind the bar, his face the color of old paper. The poker players stared at each other. Sullivan picked up his cards and immediately put them down again because his hands were shaking too badly to hold them. At his corner table, Elias Kane finished his whiskey. And for the first time in 14 months, the most feared man in Carrion Creek did something that nobody in that saloon had ever seen him do. He poured himself a second glass before the first one was gone. He was rattled. Whatever Clara Dunnigan had stirred in him, whatever buried thing her proposition had scraped against, it had knocked him off balance. Just slightly. Just enough to change his routine. And in a man like Elias Kane, a change in routine was the most dangerous thing in the world. Because it meant he was thinking. And when Elias Kane thought, things happened. Terrible, irreversible things. The wedding took place at 10 o'clock the following morning, in the small clapboard church at the east end of Carrion Creek's only real street. Reverend Amos Tuttle performed the ceremony with trembling hands and a voice that cracked twice during the vows, because the groom was armed and the Reverend was not a brave man. Clara wore her mother's dress, a simple thing, cotton and lace, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. It didn't fit well. Her mother had been softer, shorter, shaped by a gentler life. Clara's shoulders strained the seams. But she wore it because it was the only connection she had left to a time when the Dunnigan name meant something that didn't require a gun to defend. Kane wore what he always wore. Black coat, black hat, the Colt navy on his left hip. He stood at the altar the way he stood everywhere, slightly angled, weight on his back foot. Eyes moving across the windows and doors with the unconscious vigilance of a man who expected violence the way other men expected weather. He said "I do," the way he might have said, "Pass the salt," without inflection, without ceremony, without the faintest trace of sentiment. There were no guests. Old Tommy Mudd served as witness because Clara asked him, and because Tommy owed Hector Dunnigan a debt that death hadn't erased. The second witness was a woman named Louise Harding, who ran the boarding house and was the closest thing Clara had to a friend in town. Louise wept during the ceremony, though whether from emotion or fear, she couldn't have said herself. When it was done, when the paper was signed and the Reverend had pronounced them man and wife with all the enthusiasm of a man reading his own death warrant, Clara and Cain walked out of the church into the white blast of the morning sun. And the street was empty. Not casually empty. Deliberately empty. The kind of empty that happens when an entire town has collectively decided to be somewhere else. Doors were closed. Curtains were drawn. Even the dogs had disappeared. Carrion Creek had heard about the wedding, and Carrion Creek wanted no part of whatever was coming next. What came next arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Clara and Cain had ridden out to the Dunnigan ranch together, Clara on her bay mare, Cain on the black gelding he'd brought with him from wherever he'd come from. A horse as dark and taciturn as its owner. Clara showed him the property. The house. The barn. The corrals. The creek that gave the town its water, running clear and cold through the cottonwood grove below the main pasture. The spring that fed it, bubbling up from the sandstone at the base of the low mesa behind the house. Cain said almost nothing during the tour. He looked at everything with those assessing gray eyes, and Clara could see him cataloging the terrain the way a general surveys a battlefield: sight lines, cover positions, approaches, retreat routes. He wasn't seeing a ranch. He was seeing a defensive position. And whatever he saw, he seemed to find it acceptable, because he gave a single nod when they returned to the house and said, "This'll do." At 4 o'clock. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern road. Clara saw it from the porch. 6 riders, coming fast, raising a plume of desert dust that hung in the still air like smoke. She didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. "Crawley," she said. Cain was sitting in a chair on the porch, Hector's chair, though Clara hadn't told him that and he hadn't asked. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for his gun. He watched the riders approach with the patient stillness of a man who had watched men approach him many, many times before and had outlived all of them. Buford Crawley rode at the front of the group. He was mounted on a gray thoroughbred that must have cost more than most men in Carrion Creek earned in a year, a horse bred for show, not for work, which told you everything you needed to know about its owner. Crawley wore his usual dark suit, somehow unwrinkled despite the ride, and a flat-crowned hat that shaded his face. Behind him rode Declan Marsh, his foreman, a wiry, sunburned man with quick hands and a reputation for cruelty, and 4 miners who carried rifles across their saddle horns with the casual comfort of men who'd used them before. They stopped 30 yards from the porch. Close enough to talk. Far enough to shoot. Crawley looked at Cain. Cain looked at Crawley. The 2 men regarded each other across the dusty yard with the mutual recognition of predators who have encountered each other's species before and understand the rules of engagement. "Mr. Cain," Crawley said. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "I hear congratulations are in order." Cain said nothing. "I confess I'm surprised," Crawley continued. "I wouldn't have taken you for the marrying type. But then, love makes fools of us all." "State your business," Clara said from behind Cain's chair. Crawley's eyes moved to her, and the friendliness in them cooled by several degrees. "My business hasn't changed, Mrs. Cain. I want the water rights. My offer stands, reduced, of course, to reflect current market conditions and the diminished state of your operation." "The answer hasn't changed either," Clara said. Crawley smiled. It was the kind of smile that reached his mouth but died before it got anywhere near his eyes. "I was afraid you'd say that. Which is why I brought Mr. Marsh here to make a more persuasive case." Declan Marsh urged his horse forward 2 steps. He was watching Cain with the bright, feverish intensity of a man who wanted very badly to prove something. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol, a Remington, newer than Cain's Colt, shinier, less proven. "This doesn't have to be complicated," Marsh said. His voice was thin and sharp, like a blade being drawn across a whetstone. You sign the papers, we ride out. Nobody gets planted. Kane spoke for the first time since the riders had appeared. Get off this land. 4 words again. The same number he'd given Clara in the saloon. But where those words had been a negotiation, these were something else entirely. These were a verdict. Final. Absolute. Carrying behind them the weight of every man Elias Kane had ever killed and the promise of every man he was still willing to kill. Declan Marsh heard it. His hand tightened on the Remington. His jaw clenched. Every instinct in his body was telling him to draw, to prove himself, to show Crawley and the others that he wasn't afraid. But he didn't draw. Because he looked into Elias Kane's eyes and saw something that his instincts couldn't override: the absolute, mathematical certainty that he would die if he pulled that gun. Not a possibility. Not a risk. A certainty. Written in those gray eyes like scripture. Marsh's hand slowly, very slowly, moved away from the Remington. Crawley watched this happen. His smile faded. Something cold and calculating settled into his expression, replacing the false warmth like ice forming over still water. Very well, Crawley said. We'll give you time to reconsider. That's the civilized thing to do. He turned his horse. Marsh and the miners followed. They rode back the way they'd come, and the dust clouds swallowed them inch by inch until they were gone. Clara exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. That was too easy, she said. Kane was still watching the horizon where the riders had vanished. His face was unreadable, but his hand, resting on the arm of the chair, had curled into a fist. He's not coming back to talk, Kane said quietly. Next time, he's coming to burn. Crawley gave them 3 days. 3 days of silence, of normalcy so aggressive it felt threatening. The mining operation continued as usual. Crawley's men went about their work in the hills. No one visited the ranch. No one sent messages. The town went on breathing its shallow, frightened breaths, pretending nothing was wrong, the way towns always do when violence is gathering just beyond their edges. Clara used those 3 days. She and Kane worked the ranch from dawn until dark, not as husband and wife, but as 2 people preparing for a siege. Kane reinforced the shutters on the house with extra planks from the barn. He dug a trench along the western approach where the terrain was flattest and a mounted attack was most likely. He positioned water barrels at strategic points around the property, not for drinking, but for extinguishing fires. Because he'd been right. When Crawley came back, he would come to burn. Clara's 4 remaining ranch hands were told what was coming. 2 of them quit on the spot. She didn't blame them. The other 2 stayed. One was a grizzled old cowman named Whitfield who had worked for Hector Dunnigan since before Clara was born and who said simply, "I ain't leaving Hector's land to no mining trash." The other was a young Mexican vaquero named Alejandro Reyes, who said nothing at all but spent the afternoon cleaning his Winchester with the calm, methodical focus of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. On the 3rd night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with a lamp turned low, a cup of coffee going cold between her hands, staring at the wall and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Not the marriage. The marriage was strategy, and she didn't regret strategy. She wondered if she'd miscalculated Crawley. If his patience was deeper than she thought. If he would simply wait her out, year after year, tightening the noose so slowly that she choked before she realized it was there. Kane appeared in the doorway. He moved so quietly that she didn't hear him until he was already there, a shadow among shadows, his face half-lit by the lamp. He was fully dressed, fully armed. She suspected he hadn't slept either, but not from worry. From vigilance. From the habit of a man who had learned that the dark hours were when death did its best work. He sat down across from her. She poured him coffee. They sat in silence for a long time, 2 strangers bound by a document that meant nothing and a danger that meant everything. "Why Carrion Creek?" Clara asked finally. Of all the places you could have stopped, why here? Kane looked at her. The lamplight softened his features, erased some of the hardness, and for a moment she could see the man he might have been, in some other life, some other world, where whatever had happened to him hadn't happened. I was tired, he said. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. Possibly the most personal thing he had said to anyone in years. 2 words that contained entire volumes, of running, of killing, of waking in strange rooms with blood on his hands and nowhere left to go. Clara nodded. She understood tiredness. Not his kind, maybe, but her own. When this is over, she said, you can have the south 800 acres free and clear. I'll sign them over. You can do what you want with them. Build something. Or just be left alone. Whatever you need. Kane was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly, Nobody's given me anything in a long time. Before Clara could respond, Whitfield's voice came from outside, sharp and urgent, cracking the silence like a whip. Riders! Coming from the east. 15, maybe 20. Kane was on his feet before Whitfield finished the sentence. The coffee cup was still rocking on the table as he crossed the kitchen, snatched his rifle from beside the door, and disappeared into the night. Clara grabbed her father's Winchester and followed. The moon was full. That was the only mercy. It hung above the desert like a silver coin, flooding the landscape with pale light that turned the sagebrush to ghosts, and the distant hills to cutouts against the sky. And in that light, Clara could see them, a line of riders stretching across the eastern approach, moving at a canter, their silhouettes black against the moonlit dust they raised. Not 15. Not 20. Closer to 30. Crawley had brought nearly his entire operation. The barn first, Kane said from beside her. He was calm. Impossibly calm. The calmness of deep water. They'll try to fire the barn and the haystacks, drive the cattle, create chaos. Then they'll come for the house. He turned to Whitfield and Alejandro, who had materialized from the bunkhouse with their weapons. Whitfield, take the north corner of the house. You can cover the barn approach from there. Alejandro, the trench on the west side. Don't fire until they're within 100 yards. The old Calba and the young vaquero moved without question. They moved because Elias Kane spoke with the authority of a man who had commanded men before, in war, perhaps. Or in whatever shadow life he'd lived before Carrion Creek, and because his voice carried the only currency that mattered in a moment like this, certainty. Clara took position at the front window. Her hands were steady on the Winchester. Her heart was hammering, but her hands were steady, and that was what mattered. The riders came. They came with fire. Torches bloomed in the darkness like infernal flowers, carried by men on horseback who rode hard toward the barn, toward the haystacks, toward the corral fences. The night filled with the thunder of hooves, the crackle of flames finding dry wood, the panic screaming of cattle. Kane fired the first shot. It was precise, unhurried, the crack of the rifle splitting the night like God had snapped his fingers. A rider at the front of the group jerked sideways and tumbled from his horse, the torch falling from his hand and dying in the dirt. Kane worked the lever and fired again. A second man fell. A third. Each shot was a surgical excision, removing threats with the impersonal efficiency of a man pulling weeds from a garden. Clara fired. Whitfield fired. Alejandro fired from the trench. The ranch erupted in a storm of muzzle flashes and lead, and the night became a howling chaos of gunfire, shouting, and the screams of wounded men and terrified animals. The barn caught fire despite their efforts. The flames leaped upward, orange and furious, turning the night to hellish day, illuminating the battlefield in wavering, demonic light. Through the firelight, Clara could see faces, the faces of miners, terrified and enraged. Men who dug copper for a living and had been press-ganged into a war they didn't want by a man in a suit who was nowhere near the fighting. Because Crawley wasn't there. Clara scanned the riders, the chaos, the darkness beyond the firelight, and Buford Crawley was nowhere to be seen. He had sent his men to do his dying for him. The attack lasted 20 minutes. It felt like 20 hours. When it was over, when the surviving riders had broken and fled back into the darkness, leaving their dead and wounded scattered across the Dunnigan property like discarded playing cards, Clara counted the cost. The barn was gone. Half the cattle had scattered into the desert. Whitfield had taken a bullet through the shoulder and was bleeding badly. Alejandro was untouched. Cain was untouched. Clara had a graze along her left arm that she didn't feel until the adrenaline faded, and then it burned like a brand. 7 of Crawley's men lay dead or dying on the ground. 7 men who had been alive that morning, who had eaten breakfast and complained about the heat and thought about women or home or the wages they were owed. Clara looked at them in the fading firelight and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph. Grief. Dawn came bloody, the way it always does in the desert, the sky turning from black to deep red, then orange, then the punishing white gold of full morning. Clara Dunnigan stood on her porch and surveyed the wreckage of her father's dream. The barn was a charred skeleton, still smoking. Dead men lay in her yard. Her cattle were scattered across 20 miles of open desert. And somewhere to the east, Buford Crawley was sitting in his office, calculating his next move. Because Clara knew, and Cain knew, that last night hadn't been the end. It had been a prologue. Crawley had lost men, yes. 7 dead, at least 4 more wounded who'd been dragged away by retreating riders. But he still had numbers. He still had money. He still had the sheriff and the law and the infinite patience of a man who viewed human beings as expendable resources. Cain was cleaning his rifle on the porch. He'd been awake all night, Clara wasn't sure he'd blinked, and yet he showed no sign of fatigue. He worked the cleaning rod through the barrel with slow, precise strokes, his face as unreadable as stone. "He won't wait this time," Cain said without looking up. "Last night was supposed to be decisive. It wasn't. Now he's scared, and scared men do stupid things fast. So what do we do?" Cain set down the rifle. He looked at her, and for the second time since she'd known him, something moved behind his eyes, something warm, something human, something that the rest of the world never got to see. "We don't wait for him to come to us," Cain said. "We go to him." Clara stared at him. "The 2 of us. Against Crawley and however many men he has left. Not against his men. Against him. Cut the head off, and the body falls." He paused. "That's how it's always done." It was the closest he'd ever come to telling her about his past, that single word. Always. Carrying the weight of 100 implied stories. 100 other heads he'd cut off other bodies, in other places, for reasons she might never know. They rode at noon. Just the 2 of them. Alejandro stayed behind to tend to Whitfield and guard the ranch, armed with a Winchester and the fierce, quiet courage that was his only language. Clara and Cain rode east, toward the mining camp, toward Buford Crawley, toward whatever was waiting for them at the end of this road they'd chosen together. The mining camp sat in a shallow valley between 2 low ridges, a collection of tents and wooden shacks clustered around the dark mouth of the main shaft like parasites around a wound. The stamp mill stood at the north end, its machinery silent. No work was being done today. Men stood in groups, talking in low voices, glancing toward the main office, a larger shack with glass windows and a tin roof that gleamed in the sun. They saw Clara and Cain coming. Of course they did. 2 riders approaching across open desert are visible for miles. But nobody moved to stop them. Nobody raised a weapon. The miners parted like water, stepping aside, pressing against tent walls and shack fronts, creating a clear path to the office door. Because they were miners. They dug copper. They hadn't signed up for this war, and 7 of their friends were dead, and the man responsible for their deaths was sitting behind glass windows drinking coffee while they buried the bodies. Crawley's loyalty, it turned out, was a purchased thing. And purchased loyalty has a shelf life. Declan Marsh was the one who stepped out. He stood in the doorway of the office, blocking it, his hand on the Remington. His face was bruised. He'd been at the ranch last night, Clara realized, and hadn't emerged unscathed. There was a desperation in his eyes that hadn't been there before, the wild, cornered look of a man who knows his employer is losing and is trying to decide whether to go down with the ship or swim for shore. "You can't be here," Marsh said. His voice was raw. Kane dismounted. He handed his reins to Clara without looking at her, a gesture of trust so casual and so absolute that it said more than any vow he'd spoken in that church. He walked toward Marsh. Slowly. Each step deliberate, measured, his boots raising small clouds of dust that drifted and died in the still air. His hand hung at his side, inches from the Colt. His eyes were locked on Marsh's eyes, and in them was that same mathematical certainty, the equation of violence, already solved, the answer already known. "Step aside," Kane said. Marsh's hand trembled on the Remington. Sweat rolled down his face. His jaw worked, grinding words that wouldn't come. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, and he knew it, and every man watching knew it, and the silence was so heavy it could have cracked the earth. Marsh stepped aside. He moved like a man in a dream, pressing himself against the door frame, his hand falling away from the gun, his eyes dropping to the ground. He was defeated, not by violence, but by the promise of it, by the absolute certainty that Elias Kane would kill him so fast he wouldn't even feel the bullet. Kane walked through the door. Clara heard voices inside. Crawley's voice, raised, strident, stripped of its usual composure. And Kane's voice, low, steady, the voice of bedrock. She didn't hear everything. But she heard enough. She heard Crawley say something about lawyers, about territorial law, about property rights and legal claims. She heard Kane say nothing for a long time. Then she heard a sound, a chair being knocked over, a body hitting a wall, and then Crawley's voice again, higher now, thinner. The voice of a man who had finally encountered something his money couldn't solve. Kane's voice came last. Clear enough to carry through the door, through the walls, across the silent camp. "You're going to sign over every claim you have in this valley. You're going to pay for the barn you burned and the cattle you scattered. You're going to do this now, in front of your men. And then you're going to get on your horse and ride out of Carrion Creek and never come back. Because if I see your face again, Mr. Crawley, I'll bury you so deep they'll never find you." Silence. Then the scratch of a pen on paper. Buford Crawley rode out of Carrion Creek that afternoon on his gray thoroughbred, his suit wrinkled for the first time anyone could remember, his face the color of ash. Declan Marsh rode with him. They headed west, toward Tucson, and they never came back. The miners stayed. They had no quarrel with Clara Dunnigan, never had. Within a week, negotiations had begun for fair water access at fair prices, and the copper kept coming out of the hills, and the town kept breathing. And life went on the way it always does when the boot comes off the neck. Months passed. The barn was rebuilt. The cattle were recovered, most of them. Whitfield's shoulder healed, though he'd never swing a rope the same way again. Alejandro stayed on, and Clara hired new hands, and the Dunnigan ranch slowly returned to something resembling what it had been when Hector was alive. Elias Kane stayed too. Not in the house, he'd built himself a small cabin on the south 800 acres, just as Clara had promised. He ran a few head of cattle. He kept to himself, mostly. But on Sunday evenings he'd ride up to the main house, and Clara would have supper ready. And they'd eat together on the porch as the sun went down, and the desert turned to gold, and then to violet, and then to the deep starry black that only exists in country where there are no other lights to compete with the sky. They didn't talk much during those suppers. They didn't need to. They had the silence of two people who had stood together in the worst of it, and come out the other side, and that silence was worth more than words. One evening, months after Crawley's departure, Clara asked Kane the question she'd been holding since the night of the attack, the night she'd sat across from him in the kitchen and he told her he was tired. Are you still tired, Elias? He looked at her across the table. The lamplight played across his face, and for the first time since she'd known him, the emptiness in his eyes was gone. Not replaced by warmth, exactly. He wasn't that kind of man, and he never would be. But replaced by something else. Something quieter than warmth but more durable. Peace. No, he said. And then, after a moment, a word she'd never heard him say before, a word that cost him something to speak, a word that was, for a man like Elias Kane, an act of courage greater than any gunfight he'd ever survived. Home, he said. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. He didn't pull away. Outside, the desert stretched in every direction, vast, indifferent, eternal. The coyotes sang. The creek ran. The stars burned in their ancient patterns overhead, unconcerned with the small, fierce dramas that played out beneath them. And in that quiet house, on that hard land, two people who had never expected to find anything sat together in the lamplight, holding on, not to each other, not yet, but to the possibility that they might. And that was enough. Some people will tell you that the most dangerous thing in the West was a fast gun. Others will say it was greed, or heat, or the loneliness that drives men mad. But Clara Dunnigan knew the truth. The most dangerous thing in the West was the same as everywhere else. It was having something worth losing. And finally, after everything she did, they both did.